We don't know that glyphosate's a direct cause. What we know is that glyphosate affects plants and predisposes them to disease. We know that it also affects animals and through its nutrient effect and some other direct antibiotic effects on the intestinal microflora, that it also predisposes animals and humans to disease. It affects pathogens by increasing virulence, and it affects the environment and changes the natural biological controls that used to maintain effective control of Salmonella and E. coli on leaf surfaces. Those natural biological control organisms are very sensitive to glyphosate, even at very low drift rates, so that we have a different biology that we're dealing with. We're seeing a number of diseases increase in the human population. This is celiac disease, hospital admissions, cases in your neighboring province. You say, well, what's changed? What's happened? It's not a fun disease to have. Gluten intolerance is an epidemic for us. North America, parts of Europe. Not a problem in Austria. They have 0 GMO feed and GMO crops in Austria. Europe introduces and imports from the U.S. and from Argentina. If you look at all of these diseases and you see a common pattern, in this case, correlates with the adoption of glyphosate-tolerant canola. Just a correlation. Correlations don't mean anything except to send up red flags and tell you this is a place you ought to look. Everybody that eats pickles dies. Good correlation. Not a cause-effect relationship. But I can tell you, when you get this many diseases that fit the same pattern, we should be looking very seriously. Because we have an entire generation now that the Center for Disease Control said isn't going to live as long as the previous generation. Never happened before in our history. The subsequent generation has always lived longer. What's changed? We have an entire generation. We're just seeing the tip of the iceberg on. Look at inflammatory bowel disease. You look at autism. You look at celiac. You look at Crohn's. You look at Parkinson's. Multiple sclerosis. Leaky gut. Difficile diarrhea. They all fit the pattern. Study 3 years ago, Iowa, these are pig stomachs. Cattle, you get long lesions, ulcers. They'll heal and fold over. Has some critical significance I'll bring up in a minute. Pig stomachs, very much like ours. You can see what the normal stomach looks like. You can see that allergy reaction from those foreign proteins. You see the breakdown of the intestinal lining and its permeability. The leaky gut effect from this reaction. What do we do if our children can't tolerate breast milk or cow's milk? We put them on soybeans. 98% of our soybeans are GMO. Is there an association with these diseases? Correlation with inflammatory bowel disease. I was on the plane with a surgeon from New York. He was flying out to Idaho. get together with all of his classmates from medical school every 2 years. They're going to shoot the rapids. So that he spends full time on surgery for inflammatory bowel disease. It used to be a very small part of his practice. But now that's all he gets done. After the second surgery and sometimes after the first. You wear a bag around because you no longer have enough intestine left to handle your waste. You're always nutrient deficient because you don't have that absorption and that intestinal tissue and microorganisms to function with you. Gilbert Hofstadter shared the bottom slide with me. Corn breeder for prairie hybrids. Their neighbor grows the GMO. They grow only the non-GMO corn, but they sell both. Had a couple of bags that got left in the back of the warehouse, and in cleaning up, looked at them. The mice had completely devoured the non-GMO corn and hadn't hardly touched the triple stack isogenic corn. The top ones are the same comparison, isogenic comparison, triple stack versus the normal isogenic. Put up in the tree and stayed there for 9 months. Squirrels didn't like that stomach ache either. Gilbert said, maybe the mice know something I ought to know. Maybe we all ought to know. We have an epidemic of chronic botulism. Dr. Michael McNeil substituted for me this last spring in Maine at a meeting. Farmer, after showing him some of these slides, asked him if he'd come and visit his dairy. Said he's losing a cow a week. And the veterinarians can't figure out what the problem is. Dr. McNeil said when he was standing there in the barn, brought the cows in for milking, put the milker on, cow just dropped over dead. If you know what to look for, you'll see that cows aren't moving quite as rapidly, a little less muscular coordination. Just before they die, they'll salivate. Dr. Monica Kruger has shown that 1/10 of a part per million glyphosate in the feed will kill off the beneficial microorganisms in the rumen and the intestinal tract, predispose it to Clostridium, which is insensitive to the glyphosate. The Clostridium then produces the neurotoxin that we recognize as one of the most potent biological warfare agents that's known. It's not a preformed toxin. The animal's producing that toxin in its own GI tract until it finally kills it. Dr. Kruger just completed a survey of glyphosate in urine of white-collar workers in some of the larger German cities. Found up to 240 parts per million glyphosate in urine. 1/10 of a part per million is toxic to your Lactobacillus lactococcus, Bifidobacterium, your other beneficial organisms, but has no effect except to remove the competition for Clostridium botulinum, Clostridium perfringens, or Salmonella, for E. coli, that aren't sensitive to glyphosate. You change the ecology. And as you see in that capacity, you see the normal stomach, you see that bleeding rumen, you'll see the lesions from the allergy response in the rumen so that the food is only partially digested, moves through the area. You see the laying over of the tissue. An ideal environment then for the Clostridium to develop and to produce that very potent toxin in the absence then of those normal biological control organisms, so that we rarely have to worry about this problem. Visiting with a doctor that studies sudden infant death syndrome, and Dr. Kruger's laboratory has developed some very sensitive ELISA tests for the bot neurotoxin. So it's very easy to test for it now, and at nanogram quantities where it's toxic. This doctor who studies sudden infant death syndrome said now that we have the tools in every case of sudden infant death syndrome, they find the bot toxin. You say, well, how did it get there? A few years ago, the American Academy of Pediatricians advised not feeding your young children under a year's age whole foods, because Clostridium, the spores, are going to be in food and dust and dirt, and they're going to be exposed to it. And the idea was that you don't feed them the whole foods that might contain those spores until they're at least a year old, until they can develop that healthy microflora that will normally control any potential for your Clostridium. With the glyphosate, at 1/10 of a part per million being toxic to those organisms, you're not going to have that microflora. We have that much glyphosate in some of our drinking water. You can have up to 3 parts per million. Have 10 parts per million in wheat and barley and soybean meal. 100 parts per million in corn. 400 parts per million in alfalfa, Roundup Ready alfalfa. 1/10 of a part per million is all that's needed here. Of direct toxicity of glyphosate. 1/2 a part per million is an endocrine hormone disruptor. That's your pituitary, your thyroid, your reproductive hormones. It's a potent chemical. It just takes a little longer, so that if you're only going to study its effect for 14 days or 28 days, or the longest before the French study that was just released was 90 days, you're going to miss most of the effects. Sarah Lennon and his group showed that the cancer carcinogenic effects start showing up at 120 days. The only long-term study that we have on safety. But you look at all the effects, very low rates. While the kidney and the liver damage, those have been known for a long time. The birth defects been demonstrated clinically many years.